Key moments in history which led to war in Ukraine. Let me be clear, this is not a pro-Russian, pro-Putin video by any stretch of the imagination. By attacking Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has become a monstrous war criminal who deserves the full weight of international law be thrown upon him. Having said all of that, this is not a pro-Western video about what's happening in Ukraine either. Our governments in the West share the lion's share of responsibility for what has happened to the civilians of Ukraine since 2014. Of course, Russia has also played a part in this, but the aggressors have been the West. Let's take a look at some key moments in recent history which have led to the war in Ukraine. Expansion of NATO to the east from the 90s. When Georgia, along with the other former Soviet republics, proclaimed its independence in 1991, problems with the integration of what it regarded to be two of its northernmost regions started to emerge. A ceasefire deal in 1994 put an end to the civil war that these tensions had sparked in Georgia. These separatist sentiments experienced a resurgence in South Ossetia and Abkhazia in March 2008 when NATO recognized Kosovo and both areas submitted bids for recognition to the Kremlin. Georgia, encouraged by the rumored possibility of soon joining NATO, dispatched troops in the direction of South Ossetia's capital. Russia dispatched its troops to protect the provinces, which it would later recognize as independent after the war. Within 5 days, the Georgian army was routed by the Russian army, who also forced them to flee. In the 11 years that followed the Russo-Georgian War, Russia also effectively put an end to Georgia's aspirations to join NATO. Explains that out of concern for the fallout from a confrontation with Russia, NATO decided against admitting Georgia because, under Article 5, it would have been required to intervene. It is challenging to believe that NATO did not anticipate such a response, given the alliance's relentless expansion in Eastern Europe. Russian leaders had clearly said they would oppose NATO presence on their borders. It is therefore difficult to claim that the West was unaware of the effects of their actions using Georgia as a paradigm. If sincere talks were held and some of Russia's security concerns were addressed, the Russo-Ukrainian War might have been averted. Even now, the horrors of this war might be lessened if the West and Moscow have productive conversations. The collapse of the Soviet Union. The government of Russia President Boris Yeltsin, 1931 to 2007, wanted an autonomous Russia rather than trying to keep the Soviet Union together. As a result, Yeltsin was an obvious ally of Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk, 1934, but only as long as they both opposed the Soviet legacy. The union came to an end with the Ukrainian referendum in December 1991, and Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus started the formal dissolution. However, Yeltsin and other Russian figures increasingly catered to domestic nationalists, yearning for the Soviet Empire as economic reforms stalled in the early 1990s. They did this by criticizing Ukrainian cultural policies and raising doubts about the transfer of Crimea. The integrity of the Ukrainian borders was confirmed in a comprehensive treaty between Russia and Ukraine in 1997. This was also guaranteed by Russia and the Western nuclear powers in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, when Ukraine agreed to hand over its stockpile of nuclear weapons made by the Soviet Union. This pact came to an end on March 31, 2019. The West backs a violent putsch in 2014. The Ukrainian Revolution, also known as the Maidan Revolution or the Ukrainian Uprising, occurred in February 2014 at the conclusion of the Euromaidan protests, when deadly clashes between protesters and security forces in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, led to the overthrow of elected President Viktor Yanukovych, the overthrow of the Ukrainian government, and the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War. President Yanukovych's abrupt decision to forgo signing a political association and free trade agreement with the European Union in favor of tighter connections to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union sparked a wave of widespread protests in November 2013. Most of the early protesters on Independence Square in Kyiv in late 2013 were young people urging Yanukovych to ratify the pact. They represented the idea of a Ukraine that is Western-oriented and rejects Russian influence by waving the Ukrainian and EU flags. Moscow, on the other hand, asserted that the Maidan demonstrations were a part of a US-backed coup attempt, citing the presence of American officials and statements endorsing the demonstrators. The path to the Russian-Ukraine war was known as this. Russia has never accepted Ukrainian sovereignty. Although Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is quickly coming to an end, the majority of Ukrainians are aware that Russia will continue to be an existential threat to their country for many years to come. Therefore, the world community must comprehend the long-term character of the forthcoming conflict. This is due to Russia's unwillingness to acknowledge Ukraine as an independent nation and the intolerance of its Western allegiance. Even now, Russia's president refers to the largest invasion of Europe since the end of World War II as a special military operation, rather than a full-fledged conflict that has forced millions of Ukrainians to flee their homes both within and outside of their nation. On February 24th, he declared to the Russian people that he was sending troops into Ukraine from the north, south, and east with the intention of demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine. He claimed that the Ukrainian government had been bullying them and committing genocide for 8 years.